I stood with the knife in my stomach, and my cheating wife collapsed in front of me, hysterical and on her knees. That's the image burned into my mind, the exact moment my life shattered into pieces. Emily's tear-streaked face, her hands trembling, reaching toward me like she could somehow fix the mess she'd made. But nothing she could do or say would patch this up. I stood there, half-stunned, clutching the metaphorical blade of betrayal that she'd thrust deep, her lies like salt in the wound. Why? I choked out, forcing myself to look her in the eyes, needing to see if there was any trace of remorse, any hint of the woman I thought I'd married. I've become the laughingstock of all your friends. Those guys were all over you, and you did nothing to stop them. If I wanted to be treated like garbage, I would have stayed with one of my ex-girlfriends. Her face fell, and she started to speak, but words tumbled out in broken fragments, excuses I didn't want to hear. It was too late. I'd already seen her with him, had already read those messages. All those lies, the sneaking around, the betrayals stacked one on top of the other until they nearly crushed me. Then, in a blur, the situation spiraled. The door flew open, and 2 security guards, alerted by the commotion, charged in and grabbed that bastard Jason, who'd just been laughing moments before. Now he was struggling, panicking as they pinned him down, and I watched as everything I'd tried to ignore unraveled before my eyes. It's funny how quickly life can go from normal to nightmare. Just days ago, I was just a regular guy, thinking I had a loving wife and a stable marriage. Now I was a man betrayed, my life turned upside down in one swift, brutal revelation. The anger, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal were like waves crashing over me, leaving me gasping for breath. And in that chaotic moment, as Emily wept and Jason fought against the security guards, I felt one thing clearly: this was just the beginning. The scene was pure chaos, yet I couldn't move. Emily was on her knees in front of me, sobbing as if she were the victim, as if I were the one who had shattered her world. Meanwhile, Jason struggled, shouting profanities as the guards tightened their grip on him. My fists clenched at my sides, every fiber of my being demanding I do something, anything, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they'd inflicted on me. "Please, let me explain," Emily gasped, her voice thick with desperation, eyes swollen and red. But her words felt empty, hollow, like the promises she'd broken over and over again. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some mistake we could fix over coffee and a long talk. This was betrayal, calculated and cruel. "Explain?" I spat, my voice sharp with anger, even as my chest tightened with hurt. "Explain what, Emily? Explain how you looked me in the eyes every day and lied? How you snuck around, thinking I was too stupid to notice?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was as if she was finally realizing that there was no excuse, no clever story to spin that could justify what she'd done. Her silence was louder than any confession, confirming every suspicion I'd ignored, every red flag I'd brushed aside. My stomach twisted as I thought back to all those times I'd tried to be supportive, to be a good husband, only to have my trust thrown back in my face. The guards finally had Jason under control, pinning his arms behind him as he sneered, looking at me with a smugness that made my blood boil. "What's the big deal, man?" he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She wanted something you couldn't give her. That's not my fault." His words hit me like a slap. I lunged forward, fists ready to make him pay, but one of the guards stepped in, holding me back. The other guard tightened his grip on Jason, muttering a warning for him to keep his mouth shut. My whole body was shaking with anger, with humiliation, with the weight of everything I'd ignored and dismissed to keep this marriage intact. Emily scrambled to her feet, reaching out as if to stop me. "Please, don't. This is all a misunderstanding. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Her voice was barely a whisper, almost drowned out by the thundering in my ears. How many times had she convinced me of the same lies? How many nights had she come home, acting as if everything was fine, while this whole time she was with him? Not supposed to be like this? I echoed, my voice a mixture of disbelief and rage. Tell me, Emily, how exactly was it supposed to go? Were you planning on leaving me eventually? Or were you just going to keep me around, like some fool, while you enjoyed your little affair on the side? Her face paled, and for a second, I thought I saw guilt, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced by a defensive glare. You're acting crazy, she snapped, the desperation in her voice giving way to anger. If you weren't so busy with work, if you paid even the slightest bit of attention, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I stared at her, stunned. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd spent years with, built a life with. Here she was, turning the blame on me, as if I'd forced her to betray me. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, each word twisting the knife in my stomach. You don't get to blame me, I said quietly, my voice hardening as I forced back the swell of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. You made this choice. You threw away our marriage for him. I jerked my head toward Jason, who was still restrained by the guards, watching our exchange with a smirk that only fueled my anger. Emily hesitated, but then her face hardened, and I saw something there I'd never expected, resentment. Maybe I wouldn't have had to look somewhere else if you weren't so busy all the time, she said, her voice cold. You never noticed me anymore, never cared. All you saw was work, work, work. Her words echoed in my mind, each one a bitter accusation. It was as if she was trying to rewrite the past, to make herself out as the victim. But I knew the truth. I'd sacrificed, yes, I'd worked hard for us, for our future. I thought I was doing the right thing, being the responsible husband. But apparently, that hadn't been enough. Don't act like this was my fault, I said, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. I would have given you anything. Everything. And you threw it away. You lied, you cheated, and now you're standing here, acting like you're the one who's been wronged. Emily's gaze faltered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely ashamed. But the moment was brief, fleeting. She turned away, folding her arms defensively, as if protecting herself from the truth. The guard started to pull Jason toward the exit, and I watched him go, feeling a twisted sense of relief that, at least for now, he was out of my sight. But even as they took him away, the damage was done. The betrayal, the humiliation, the utter disregard for everything we'd built together, it all hung between us, an unbridgeable chasm. As Emily stood there, arms crossed, eyes cold, I realized that whatever we'd had was gone. She'd made her choice, and now I had to make mine. This was no longer a life, a marriage I could save. She'd burned it to the ground, leaving nothing but ashes and the stinging, unforgiving truth. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. The woman I'd loved was a stranger now, someone I couldn't recognize, someone who had ripped apart our life without a second thought. As I stared at her, the full weight of what had happened settled in. This was no temporary break, no rough patch we'd get through together. She'd burned every bridge, crossed every line. And there she stood, arms folded, eyes flashing with that same defiant glare, as if daring me to challenge her excuses. The reality was a punch to the gut, the woman I'd thought I'd known, trusted, loved, she didn't exist anymore. In her place was someone cold, someone who would twist the knife and blame me for bleeding. But I wasn't going to let her have the last word. Tell me something, Emily, I began, my voice low, barely keeping the anger in check. When you looked at me every day and lied, when you laughed with me, kissed me, told me you loved me, did any part of that mean anything to you? For a second, just a flicker, I thought I saw regret in her eyes. But it was gone before I could be sure, replaced by that hard, defensive look. Don't act like this is all my fault, she snapped, her voice dripping with indignation. You were the one who was never there. I'm supposed to just sit around, invisible, waiting for you to notice me? Her words cut deep, and a part of me felt the sting of truth. Yes, I'd worked long hours. Yes, I'd put everything I had into my career, thinking I was building a life for us, securing a future. I thought she understood. I thought she was on my side. But the truth hit me like a cold slap. She didn't care about our future. She'd only cared about herself, about what she could get in the moment, and when that moment passed, she'd gone looking elsewhere. "Don't you dare try to put this on me," I growled, each word laced with barely contained fury. "You knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were risking every single time you lied to my face and went running to him. And now you stand here and act like you're the victim?" Her face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe if you weren't so self-absorbed, you would have seen what was right in front of you." Her defiance was maddening, but it was also revealing. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was only sorry that she got caught. Right in front of me? I echoed, the sarcasm biting. "You mean all the times you worked late, or those weekend business trips that popped up out of nowhere? Tell me, did you laugh about it with him? Did you both sit around talking about how blind I was, how easy it was to fool me?" I could feel my voice rising, the anger boiling over, and I didn't care. I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal I'd felt, wanted her to know just how deeply she'd cut. But Emily just rolled her eyes, crossing her arms tighter as if trying to shield herself from the accusations. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're acting like you were the perfect husband. Like you didn't make your own mistakes." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Mistakes? I worked hard for us. I sacrificed for us. I believed in us. If that's my mistake, then yes, I made it. But nothing I did could ever justify this." She stayed silent, her jaw clenched, refusing to meet my gaze. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, and in that moment, I knew there was no salvaging this. She'd made her choice. I'd seen her true colors, and there was no going back. But as I took a step back, ready to leave her standing there in the wreckage she'd created, her expression shifted. Something dark flickered in her eyes, something that made my stomach churn. "You know what?" she said, her voice icy. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. I'm done pretending, done playing the perfect wife for someone who barely even noticed I was there." Each word was like a slap, a final twist of the knife she'd plunged into my back. The anger, the bitterness, the sheer lack of remorse, all of it flooded out of her, and I realized then just how little she had valued everything we'd shared. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice a mix of disbelief and rage. "You think you can just walk away like none of this matters? Like we never mattered?" She shrugged, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe it never did. Maybe it was all just a comfortable routine, and we both got lazy. But now? Now I don't have to pretend anymore." Her words were a final, crushing blow. I'd thought I'd seen every side of her, thought I knew the depth of her betrayal, but this was something else. This was a level of callousness I hadn't expected. She wasn't just ending things, she was burning every bridge, making it clear that nothing we'd built together had ever truly mattered to her. I took a shaky breath, the hurt clawing at my chest, mingling with a deep, simmering anger that I could barely control. "If you wanted freedom so badly, you could have just said something," I spat, my voice hoarse. "But instead, you lied. You played me. And now, you don't even have the decency to own up to it." For the first time, her confident facade cracked, her eyes flashing with a hint of vulnerability. But it was fleeting, a flicker in the storm, and it vanished just as quickly, replaced by that cold, hardened stare. "You know what?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Maybe I did you a favor. Now you don't have to waste your life with someone who never wanted what you did." Those words stung, and I felt my resolve harden. This wasn't a woman who wanted forgiveness, who wanted to make things right. She was a stranger, someone who would rather twist the knife and walk away than face the damage she'd done. Fine, I whispered, the finality of it settling over me like a weight. You're right. Maybe you did me a favor. Because now I know exactly who you are. She gave a bitter laugh, her expression as cold as ever, and turned on her heel, heading toward the door without another word. As I watched her go, I felt the pieces of my broken heart settle into a steely resolve. I would survive this. I would get through it. And one day, I'd look back and be grateful that I'd seen her for who she really was. But for now, all I could do was stand there, alone in the silence, and let the pain wash over me, knowing that this was the end of a chapter I'd once thought would last a lifetime. When Emily left, the silence in our house was suffocating. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, every tiny noise felt amplified, filling the emptiness she left behind. The anger, the shock, they'd worn off, replaced by a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest, a feeling I couldn't escape. I sat in the dark, surrounded by the familiar, the things we'd built together, all now tainted with memories I could barely stand to face. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I replayed every detail, every lie, every moment that had led us here, trying to make sense of it all. I thought back to the early days, when we'd laugh until we couldn't breathe, when every glance, every touch felt electric. I'd been so sure she was the one. So sure we'd make it. And now, here I was, picking up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. The next morning, I woke to a series of texts from friends. News travels fast, and I knew Emily had probably spun her side of the story to anyone who would listen. In her version, she was probably the misunderstood, neglected wife, driven to look for comfort elsewhere. But I knew better. I knew the truth of her betrayal, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite it. A message from my closest friend, Ben, stood out. Heard about what happened, man. I'm here if you need anything. You don't deserve this. For the first time since she walked out, I felt a hint of relief. I wasn't entirely alone. I had people who would stand by me, people who knew me, knew the lengths I'd gone to keep this marriage alive. I texted him back, grateful for the support, and decided it was time to pull myself together, if only just a little. I threw on a jacket and headed outside. The cold air hit me like a wake-up call, snapping me out of my haze. I started walking, no destination in mind, just needing to clear my head. I passed by the coffee shop we used to go to every Saturday morning, the park where we'd spent countless afternoons, all now reduced to painful reminders. Lost in thought, I barely noticed the figure approaching until he was right in front of me. Jason. Of all the people I could have run into that day, it had to be him, the man who'd so casually walked into my life and torn it apart. He stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, a smug look plastered across his face. "You've got some nerve," I muttered, my fists clenching instinctively. He raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, man, I didn't come here to start anything. Just wanted to say it's not personal. You know how it is." "Not personal?" I echoed, my voice laced with disbelief. "You destroyed my marriage, my life, and you have the audacity to stand here and tell me it's not personal?" He shrugged, completely unfazed. "It's just how things go. If she wasn't happy with you, that's not my fault. People change, move on. Maybe you should, too." His words were like gasoline on a fire, stoking a rage I'd barely been able to keep in check. I took a step forward, the urge to knock that smug expression off his face overwhelming. "You think this is some game?" I spat, my voice shaking. "You walk in, take what doesn't belong to you, and walk away like none of it matters?" He rolled his eyes, clearly bored, clearly enjoying the power he had over me. "Look, if it wasn't me, it would have been someone else. She was already on her way out, buddy. Maybe face that instead of blaming me." That was it. Every ounce of anger, humiliation, and betrayal I'd been holding back surged forward, and before I could think twice, I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, my voice a deadly whisper. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" He sneered, his confidence unwavering. "Yeah, I do. Because, unlike you, I know how to keep someone's interest." Something in me snapped, and I shoved him back, barely keeping myself from doing worse. The last thing I needed was to end up in jail because of him. He stumbled, catching himself, and chuckled, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered, brushing himself off. "No wonder she got bored." He turned to walk away, leaving me standing there, my fists clenched, my blood boiling. Every part of me wanted to go after him, to make him pay for what he'd done. But I knew that giving him that satisfaction would only make me look weaker. This was a battle I couldn't win with fists. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. This wasn't the way. I wouldn't let him reduce me to his level. If he thought he'd won, he was wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I would find a way to move on, to rebuild my life without letting him or Emily drag me down. I spent the next few days laying low, focusing on myself, processing everything that had happened. It was tough, and there were moments where the weight of it all felt unbearable. But slowly, I started to realize something. I'd been carrying the weight of a marriage that only I believed in. I'd been the only one fighting, the only one willing to sacrifice. And now that it was over, maybe, just maybe, I could finally breathe again. Ben came over one evening with a six-pack and a knowing look. "So," he said, settling onto my couch, "what's the plan?" "The plan?" I echoed, not sure what he meant. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "The plan for your life, man. You don't have to be stuck in this mess forever. You've got options. You don't need her." And he was right. I didn't need her. I didn't need the lies, the betrayal, the constant feeling of being less than enough. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe this was a chance to find myself again, to rebuild from the ground up. In the following days, I started making changes. I reached out to a lawyer, began the process of separation, of truly letting go. It hurt more than I thought possible, but each step felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of the life that had been stolen from me. And as I stood there, signing the final papers, a strange calm washed over me. This chapter was closing, and while it had been painful, it was also a reminder of my own strength, of my ability to survive. I looked forward, no longer haunted by the past, ready to face whatever lay ahead with a new sense of purpose. Jason and Emily were just ghosts now, reminders of a life I'd outgrown. The pain, the anger, they were fading, replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable, resilience. A month passed, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Emily was out of my life, and Jason had faded into the background, little more than a bad memory. I'd thrown myself into work, focused on my health, and even reconnected with old friends. For the first time in a long time, things felt steady. One evening, as I was wrapping up at the office, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" I answered, bracing for a sales pitch. "Is this David Reynolds?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, formal, but there was something urgent in her tone. "Yes, this is David," I replied cautiously. "Who's calling?" "My name is Detective Lauren Fields," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "I'm calling regarding Emily Parker." My heart skipped a beat. Emily. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce proceedings began. As far as I was concerned, she was out of my life for good. But hearing her name brought a rush of unease. Is she okay?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. There was a pause. "Mr. Reynolds, we'd like you to come down to the station. We have some questions." My mind raced. Questions? What could they possibly need to ask me about Emily? I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach, the feeling of stepping into something I wasn't prepared for. I agreed to meet with the detective and grabbed my coat, my thoughts a whirlwind as I headed out of the office. At the station, Detective Fields met me in a small, sterile room, her face serious. She slid a file across the table, opening it to reveal photos of Emily and Jason. My jaw clenched as I recognized the smug expression on his face, his arm around her as they sat in what looked like a fancy hotel room. "I'm sorry if this is difficult to look at," Detective Fields began, her tone steady. "But it's important that we understand what you know about these two." I forced myself to keep calm, trying to ignore the raw stab of old wounds reopening. "Emily and I are in the middle of a divorce," I said. "She cheated on me with that guy, Jason. I found out a few months ago." Detective Fields nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see. And were you aware of any other activities they might have been involved in?" "Other activities?" I repeated, frowning. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, hands clasped. "Mr. Reynolds, Jason isn't who he says he is. We've been investigating him for months. He's a con artist, a serial manipulator. He's been targeting women in the area, getting them to trust him before draining them of their money and disappearing." The words hung in the air, sinking in slowly. "Wait, you're saying he used Emily? That she was just another one of his marks?" "Yes," she replied. "It seems he played her for everything she had. We believe he convinced her to take out loans, empty savings, even put up her property as collateral for various business ventures. She's lost nearly everything." I sat back, trying to process what she was telling me. Emily, with all her arrogance, her insistence that she didn't need me, had been scammed by the very man she'd left me for. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction, but another part of me, the part that had once loved her, felt a pang of pity. She'd thrown me aside, only to be betrayed herself. Detective Fields continued, her gaze steady. "We need to know if you've had any contact with Jason recently, or if Emily ever mentioned any unusual activities before your separation." I shook my head, still in shock. "No, nothing like that. I only knew him as the guy she left me for. I had no idea he was a con artist." The detective's expression softened. "I understand. But there's one more thing, and I need you to be prepared. Jason isn't the type to just disappear. We have reason to believe he's still in the area, possibly keeping tabs on Emily, and, unfortunately, on you as well." The weight of her words hit me hard. "Why me? I'm not involved in this." Detective Fields nodded. "That may be true, but Jason has a pattern of tying up loose ends. People he views as a threat tend to disappear. We believe he's aware that you've been in close contact with Emily and could potentially interfere with his plans." A chill ran down my spine. The guy who'd taken everything from me, who'd humiliated me, had turned out to be more dangerous than I could have imagined. And now, he was lurking somewhere, possibly watching, waiting. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "For now, we suggest you stay vigilant," Detective Fields replied, sliding her card across the table. "If you see anything suspicious, if he tries to contact you, call us immediately. We're monitoring the situation closely, but it's important you stay cautious." I left the station in a daze, my mind reeling from everything I'd just learned. Emily had betrayed me, yes, but in a way, she'd been betrayed too, a pawn in Jason's twisted game. And now, like it or not, I was part of that game. The following days were filled with a tense, uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. I checked over my shoulder constantly, suspicious of every shadow, every stranger's gaze lingering a bit too long. I'd become hyper-aware, always on edge, expecting Jason to appear at any moment. And then, one evening, just as I was locking up at home, I heard a knock on the door. My heart pounded as I approached, a million thoughts racing through my mind. I glanced through the peephole, half expecting Jason's smug face. But it was Emily. She looked different, haggard, worn down, like the life had been drained out of her. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slumped. I opened the door, unsure whether to feel anger or pity. She looked up at me, her expression desperate. "David, I know I'm the last person you want to see, but please. I need your help." I stared at her, torn between slamming the door in her face and hearing her out. She was a mess, clearly shaken, and part of me, despite everything, couldn't ignore the part of myself that once cared about her. I sighed, stepping aside to let her in. She looked around, as if expecting Jason to pop out of the shadows at any moment. She took a shaky breath, clutching her arms around herself. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jason, he's dangerous, David. He's been following me, threatening me. He says if I don't find a way to pay him back, he'll make sure I regret it." The pity I'd felt for her grew, but so did the anger. "You chose him, Emily. You threw me away for him." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I know, and it was the worst mistake of my life. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, David, I don't know where else to go. I just need your help." In that moment, every bitter feeling, every piece of hurt and anger clashed with the realization that she was terrified, truly afraid for her life. Despite everything, I couldn't deny that she needed someone to protect her. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to see this through to the end. I looked at her, my expression hardening. "Fine. But if we're going to do this, we're doing it my way." And with that, a plan began to form, one that would finally bring Jason down for good. As I stood there, looking at Emily, broken, afraid, the fire in her spirit reduced to embers, I felt something shift in me. Despite everything, a part of me wanted to protect her, to shield her from the monster she'd let into her life. Maybe it was old love, maybe it was pride, or maybe I just needed to see this through to the bitter end. She sat on the couch, fidgeting, eyes darting to the windows like she expected Jason to jump out at any moment. Her fear was palpable, and as much as I hated to admit it, I didn't think she was exaggerating. Jason wasn't just a cheater, he was a predator, someone who saw people as disposable, things to be used and tossed aside. I couldn't let him get away with it, not after what he'd done to both of us. "Emily," I said, my voice low but firm. "If I'm going to help you, I need to know everything. No more lies, no more secrets. What exactly did he get you involved in?" She looked up at me, her face a mix of shame and desperation. He convinced me to invest," she began, her voice trembling. "He said he had a startup, some business that was going to make millions. I took out loans, David. I drained my savings. He promised I'd get it all back, but then, he started asking for more. When I said I couldn't, he got angry. My fists clenched. How much does he say you owe him?" She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. 200,000. The number hit me like a punch. Emily had gone so far down the rabbit hole with this guy that she'd given up everything. I could see now that she wasn't just scared of Jason, she was terrified of being left with nothing. He'd taken everything she'd had, and now he was back for the scraps. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. "All right," I said, "we'll get you out of this. But we're not paying him a dime. If he wants to play dirty, then so will we." She looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're going to expose him for what he is," I replied, feeling a plan start to form. "If he's been conning you, there's a good chance he's done it to others too. We'll find his other victims, gather everything we can against him, and turn it over to the police. But we're going to need leverage." Her eyes widened. "Leverage? What kind of leverage?" I pulled out my phone, flipping through old messages and contacts until I found the one I needed, Ben, my oldest friend and a tech expert who owed me more than a few favors. I shot him a quick message, asking if he could track down some information for me. Emily, I said, looking her dead in the eyes. This is going to take guts. We'll have to play him at his own game. Are you up for it? She nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her expression. She was scared, and I couldn't blame her. Jason was dangerous, but we had no other option. Over the next few days, we put our plan into motion. Ben managed to track down several women who'd been victims of Jason's schemes. One by one, I reached out, explaining the situation and asking for their help. To my surprise, they all agreed, each of them eager to see Jason brought to justice. They told me stories that mirrored Emily's, promises of love, empty assurances of wealth, and, ultimately, the theft of their hard-earned savings. It was clear that Jason wasn't just some con artist. He was a predator, someone who thrived on manipulation and control. But now, we had a way to take him down. On the night we planned to confront him, Emily was a wreck. Her hands shook as she paced the room, glancing at the clock every few seconds. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is it," I said. "We're going to end this." We'd arranged to meet Jason at a high-end restaurant downtown, a place where he'd feel in control, surrounded by wealth and power. But what he didn't know was that the women he'd scammed were waiting nearby, ready to step in as soon as we gave the signal. I'd tipped off Detective Fields as well, letting her know we'd be gathering evidence of Jason's schemes firsthand. Jason arrived right on time, dressed sharply, his usual smug grin in place as he walked over to our table. He barely acknowledged me, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Emily," he purred, sliding into the booth across from us. "I knew you'd come to your senses. So, are we ready to talk about that little debt of yours?" I forced myself to stay calm, to play my part. "We're ready to settle things, Jason," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But first, I want to understand exactly where this money is going." Jason's eyes narrowed, the faintest hint of irritation flashing across his face. "That's none of your business," he replied coldly. "Emily owes me, and I expect her to pay up." Emily spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. "I need proof, Jason. Proof that this money is really going toward what you said it would. I can't just hand over my life savings without knowing." He smirked, clearly amused. "Fine. I have some documents in my car. Give me a minute, and I'll get them." As he walked out of the restaurant, I gave the signal to Ben, who was stationed just outside with the other women. The moment Jason reached his car, they approached, confronting him with a barrage of accusations. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, surrounded by his past victims, each one demanding answers, exposing his lies for all to see. In the chaos, Detective Fields stepped forward, flashing her badge. "Jason Miller, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." His expression shifted from smug to terrified in an instant. He tried to backpedal, tried to deny everything, but the women held up their phones, each one displaying text messages, photos, evidence that he'd scammed them. There was no way out. As the officers cuffed him, he looked back at me, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Reynolds." I met his glare, unflinching. "I don't think so, Jason. This is exactly where it ends." As they dragged him away, a weight lifted off my shoulders. The nightmare was over. Emily stood beside me, tears in her eyes, relief mingling with a hint of shame. I looked at her, feeling a complicated mix of emotions, anger, pity, maybe even a sliver of forgiveness. She turned to me, her voice choked. "David, I'm so sorry. For everything." I nodded, acknowledging her apology. "It's over, Emily. We can move on now." She nodded, her gaze distant, as if seeing the damage she'd done for the first time. I knew we'd never go back to what we were, that our lives would take separate paths from here. But in that moment, I felt a sense of closure, a finality that was strangely peaceful. As I walked away, I felt a freedom I hadn't known in months. The scars were still there, the memories lingering. The weeks after Jason's arrest were a whirlwind of lawyers, court dates, and finally, a legal victory that gave some justice to the women he'd conned. Emily and I parted ways amicably. She'd lost much, but she had a chance to rebuild, and I was determined to do the same. We didn't say much to each other after the final court hearing, just exchanged a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and closure. I thought I'd finally be able to breathe, to move forward, to leave everything behind. But then, strange things started happening. It began subtly. I'd find my front door unlocked when I swore I'd locked it. A few times, I'd get home to discover lights on that I'd turned off, or items slightly out of place. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, lingering tension from the chaos with Emily and Jason. But then the text messages started. Late one night, my phone buzzed. I reached over, expecting a message from Ben or one of the other friends I'd reconnected with. Instead, the screen showed an unknown number. The message read, "I'm closer than you think." A chill ran through me. I checked the number, hoping to recognize it, but there was nothing. Just those 5 words, vague and unsettling. The next few days were silent. No more messages, no strange incidents. I told myself it was a prank or a spam text and tried to forget it, diving back into my routine, focusing on work, even going on a couple of dates. But just as I was starting to feel normal, the texts resumed, each one more disturbing than the last. Enjoying your freedom while it lasts? You think it's over, don't you? Every time I read one, that familiar, creeping dread would settle over me. I tried blocking the number, but the messages kept coming from different ones. I called the detective handling Jason's case, but she assured me he was in custody, locked up while awaiting trial. He couldn't be behind it. But who else would be? I racked my brain, trying to think of anyone who might have a vendetta against me, but I came up blank. All I knew was that someone was watching, someone who knew the darkest details of my life. A week later, I came home to find a single piece of paper slipped under my door. There was no envelope, no signature, just a handwritten message that made my blood run cold. "You're living on borrowed time, David." I went to the police, but they could only offer advice, suggesting I install cameras and document anything suspicious. I did both, but nothing appeared on the footage. Days turned into nights of sleepless anxiety. Whoever this was, they were careful, leaving no trace. Then, one night, everything escalated. I'd stayed late at the office, catching up on paperwork, when my phone buzzed with another unknown number. The message had an address I didn't recognize, and a simple, chilling invitation: "Come find out the truth." I stared at the screen, feeling trapped. It was probably another sick mind game, but a part of me couldn't let it go. What if this was finally a chance to confront whoever was doing this, to put an end to it once and for all? After a long, tense drive, I arrived at the address, an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The place was dark, the faint glow of a street lamp casting eerie shadows across the entrance. I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call for help if things went south. I took a deep breath, stepping into the darkness. The air was thick, musty, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. My footsteps echoed, every sound amplified in the silence. And then, just as I was about to turn back, a voice drifted out of the shadows. Well. You actually came. I knew you would." I froze, recognizing that voice instantly. Jason. But it couldn't be him. He was in jail, awaiting trial. I turned slowly, my heart pounding as he stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his smile twisted and sinister. "You look surprised," he said, that smug expression back on his face. "Did you really think a few bars would hold me?" "How?" I stammered, feeling my mind race to process the impossible. "They told me you were locked up." He chuckled, the sound cold and mocking. "Money can buy you a lot of things, David. Freedom, for one. Friends in high places. And now, I'm here to get what's mine." I took a step back, my pulse racing. "This is insane. The police will be looking for you. You can't just disappear without a trace." "Oh, but I don't intend to disappear," he replied, his gaze sharp, calculating. "I'm here to remind you, David, that I don't lose. You took something from me, my reputation, my plans, my freedom. Now it's your turn to lose something." He moved closer, and I felt a surge of fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I was trapped, cornered in this abandoned building with a man who had nothing left to lose. "What do you want?" I forced out, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let him see how much he terrified me. He tilted his head, studying me. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not going to kill you, David. No, I have something much better in mind. I'm going to make sure you're just as miserable, just as broken as I am. And when everyone around you is gone, when you're left with nothing but regret, maybe then you'll understand." I swallowed, trying to buy time, thinking of any way to escape. "So that's your plan? To just torment me, out of some twisted revenge?" "Not just you," he replied, a sick smile spreading across his face. "Everyone who helped you. Everyone who stood in my way. That detective, your friends, even Emily." My stomach dropped. Emily had made mistakes, but she didn't deserve this. None of them did. "Leave her out of this, Jason," I said, my voice laced with anger. "Your fight is with me." He chuckled, clearly amused by my attempt to be noble. "Oh, David, you don't get to dictate the terms here. I'm just getting started. And you're going to watch as I destroy everything you love, piece by piece." I took a step back, trying to gauge the distance to the exit. I had to get out of here, to warn everyone. But Jason must have sensed my plan, because he moved to block my path, his expression darkening. "Running already?" he taunted. "But I was hoping you'd stick around. After all, I've put so much effort into this little reunion." With a final burst of desperation, I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the concrete as I sprinted toward the exit. I could hear him laughing behind me, his voice echoing through the empty warehouse. As I burst out into the night, gasping for air, I realized that this was far from over. Jason was out there, a threat lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd promised to tear down everything I loved, to leave me with nothing, and he was the kind of man who kept his promises. But as fear turned into a hardened resolve, I knew one thing for certain: if he wanted a fight, I would give him one. I wasn't going to be his victim. Not again. After that night, I knew I couldn't go on pretending everything was normal. Jason was out there, and his threats were real. The weight of his words haunted me, and I knew he was serious about tearing down my life piece by piece. But if he thought he could frighten me into submission, he was wrong. I wasn't about to sit idly by and wait for him to ruin everything. This time, I would fight back. The first step was assembling my allies. I called Detective Fields and told her everything, about the messages, the warehouse, and my face-to-face encounter with Jason. She was shocked but took my warning seriously, promising to escalate the search for him. I then reached out to Ben, my oldest friend and a man who understood tech better than anyone I knew. If anyone could find a way to track Jason's movements, it was Ben. "We need to go on the offensive," Ben said, his voice resolute as he typed away on his laptop, fingers flying over the keys. "If Jason's been able to stay off the radar, he's probably using burner phones and staying off public networks. But if he's sending you messages, that's his weak spot. Over the next few days, Ben worked tirelessly, tracing every suspicious message I'd received, digging into any recent transactions or data points that could help pinpoint Jason's location. Meanwhile, I took a few defensive measures of my own. I installed more security cameras around my house and kept an emergency kit in my car. I was ready for anything. Then, one evening, Ben called with a breakthrough. "David, I found something. A location that Jason's cell data has pinged several times over the past week. It's a small property about 30 minutes outside the city. From the records I pulled, it's registered to a fake name, but there are a few purchases linked to it. Jason might be using it as a safe house." The address he gave me was in a secluded, wooded area, perfect for someone hiding from the law. I knew it was risky, but if I had any chance of ending this nightmare, I had to confront him. This time, on my terms. I called Detective Fields, letting her know my plan and asking her to have backup nearby. She hesitated, but eventually agreed, understanding the urgency of the situation. She'd send a couple of plainclothes officers to stay within range, ready to step in if things went south. As I drove out to the property that evening, the sky was dark, clouds heavy with rain. The roads were quiet, almost eerily so, and by the time I reached the secluded dirt road leading to Jason's hideout, a thick fog had settled, obscuring everything in a ghostly haze. I parked a safe distance away and walked quietly through the trees, careful to avoid snapping any branches underfoot. The small cabin loomed ahead, its lights casting a faint glow through the fog. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, then approached the door and knocked. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. I wondered if he wasn't there, if maybe this was all just a wild goose chase. But then, the door opened slowly, revealing Jason's face, his expression a mixture of surprise and amusement. Well, he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Look who decided to come to me. Couldn't wait for me to start ruining your life, huh?" I met his gaze, refusing to show fear. "It's over, Jason. The police know where you are. They'll be here any minute." He laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You think I'm stupid? I've been a step ahead of you this whole time, David. You came all the way out here, alone, to tell me it's over? I'd say it's just beginning." He motioned for me to come inside, but I stayed rooted in place, trying to assess the situation. I needed to buy time until Fields' backup arrived, but I couldn't let Jason realize I was stalling. "Tell me something, Jason," I said, my voice steady. "What is it you really want? Is this about revenge, or is this just some sick game for you?" Jason's smile faded, replaced by a hardness I hadn't seen before. "What I want, David, is to watch you suffer. You took something from me, my freedom, my reputation. I lost everything because of you, and now I'm going to make sure you know what that feels like." He stepped forward, eyes glinting with malice. "You know, I was going to start with Emily. But you saved me the trouble by dragging her into this mess. Now she's ruined, just like you will be." My jaw clenched. "You're blaming me? You were the one who preyed on her. You're the one who uses people like disposable objects." He smirked, shrugging casually. "People are either predators or prey, David. I'm just making sure I stay on top." I was about to respond when I heard a faint rustling outside, a subtle sign that Detective Fields and her team had arrived. I had to keep him talking, keep him distracted. "You don't have to do this, Jason," I said, trying to inject some sincerity into my voice. "You can walk away from this. Turn yourself in, and maybe you can still salvage what's left of your life." He shook his head, his expression hardening. "Nice try, but I'm not falling for that. I've come too far to stop now." At that moment, the cabin door burst open, and Detective Fields and two officers stormed in, guns drawn. Jason spun around, rage and shock flashing across his face as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "It's over, Jason," Detective Fields said, her voice firm, unwavering. "There's nowhere left to run." Jason glared at me, his eyes filled with venom. "You think this ends here?" he snarled. "You think I don't have people on the outside who will finish what I started?" The officers restrained him, cuffing his hands behind his back as he continued to rant, his threats spilling out like poison. "You'll never be safe, David. I will ruin you. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." As they led him out, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering dread. The man who'd tormented me was finally in custody, but his words echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. Even behind bars, Jason's reach might extend further than I realized. Detective Fields placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll make sure he stays locked up this time. You've been through enough, David." I nodded, grateful but still uneasy. The storm had finally broken, but I knew the shadows of Jason's threats would linger, haunting the edges of my life for some time to come. For now, though, he was gone, his twisted games put to an end. As I drove home through the fading fog, a sense of calm washed over me. My life had been turned upside down, my trust shattered, but I had faced my darkest fears and emerged stronger. Jason was a shadow I'd finally left behind, and I was ready to reclaim my life, one piece at a time. With each mile, the weight lifted, replaced by something new, something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. After that night, I felt a cautious sense of freedom. Jason was behind bars, Emily had moved on, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The shadows he'd cast over my life were finally starting to fade. I got back to work, began reconnecting with friends, and even started dating again, cautiously opening myself up to the idea of trust. Life was beginning to feel normal, almost peaceful. I let myself believe, just a little, that the worst was over. But one late evening, just as I was settling in for bed, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I glanced at it, expecting spam or some work memo, but the subject line froze me in my tracks. "Did you really think it was over?" My heart pounded as I opened the email. The message was simple, typed in a cold, familiar tone. "You've only won the first round, David. The game is far from over. Sleep well." There was no name, no signature, just those chilling words. But I knew exactly who it was from. Jason was supposed to be in prison, he'd been sentenced just last week, and I'd seen him led away in shackles. But somehow, he'd reached out, a reminder that his reach extended far beyond the bars that held him. I felt a knot in my stomach as I reread the email, analyzing every word. Could he really be communicating from inside prison, or was this a final attempt to shake me? I forwarded the email to Detective Fields, hoping she could trace its origin. Maybe it was nothing, maybe he had contacts outside who were still loyal to him, keeping his threats alive even while he was locked away. But as the days passed with no answer, the dread crept back in, like a shadow lurking just beyond the light. Then, one night, I returned home late after a work event. My house was dark, but as I stepped inside, I felt an unsettling stillness, a silence that felt wrong. The air was thick, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent, one I couldn't quite place but instinctively knew shouldn't be there. I checked the security system, everything was as I'd left it, but that sense of being watched, of not being alone, gnawed at me. I slowly moved from room to room, checking every corner, every shadow, until I was satisfied that I was truly alone. Finally, I locked my bedroom door and collapsed into bed, my nerves frayed but my exhaustion winning out. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud, metallic clanging. Heart pounding, I sat up, straining to hear. My mind raced, every possibility flashing through my head. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my room, and something on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. A small, black chess piece, the king, stood upright, as if placed there with precision. My blood ran cold. I hadn't owned a chess set in years, and there was no way anyone could have entered my locked bedroom. I stared at the piece, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of message? A reminder that he saw himself as the king, the one in control, and me as just another pawn? I picked up the piece, examining it, searching for any clue, any detail that would make it make sense. It was just a plain chess piece, but in that moment, it felt like a threat, a promise that he still had the upper hand, that he was always one step ahead. I dialed Detective Fields, barely able to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. She promised to send officers over and advised me to stay somewhere else for the night. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my essentials and left, my heart racing as I glanced back at my darkened house. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was out there, laughing, enjoying my fear. The following morning, Detective Fields called with news that made my blood run cold. The chess piece had been dusted for prints, and while no matches were found, there was no doubt in her mind that it was a message, a symbol of the game Jason had started and had no intention of ending. Days passed, each one filled with tension and paranoia. I stayed at a friend's place, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like a hunted animal. I couldn't escape the sense that Jason was lurking in the shadows, always a step ahead. The police increased their surveillance, but there was only so much they could do. And then, finally, I received an email from Detective Fields that seemed to bring the nightmare to an end. Jason is in solitary confinement as of today. There's no way he can reach you now. You're safe. Relief flooded me, but it was tempered by caution. Solitary confinement meant Jason couldn't orchestrate any more messages or threats. I took a breath, letting myself believe, even if just for a moment, that it was over. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I moved into a new apartment, far from the house that held too many painful memories, and started to feel like myself again. I reconnected with friends, picked up new hobbies, and began dating someone who brought light and laughter back into my life. The shadows faded, the memories of Jason dimming into the background. One evening, after a long day, I returned home and found a small, wrapped package on my doorstep. There was no return address, no markings to indicate where it had come from. I stared at it, every nerve in my body telling me to leave it alone, to turn and walk away. But my curiosity got the better of me. I took it inside, my heart pounding as I unwrapped it. Inside was a simple black notebook. I opened it to the first page, my hands trembling as I read the words scrawled in Jason's familiar handwriting. You can never escape me. The game is only over when I say it's over. The notebook slipped from my hands, falling to the floor as I took a step back, the room spinning. Jason was supposed to be in solitary confinement, locked away where he couldn't touch me, couldn't reach me. And yet, here was his final taunt, a chilling reminder that he would always find a way to haunt me, that he would always have the last word. As I stood there, the realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating weight. Jason might have been locked away, his body confined, but his reach was endless, his influence woven into the darkest corners of my life. He'd left his mark on me, a scar that would never fully heal, a reminder that he was always watching, waiting, somewhere out there in the shadows. And for the rest of my life, no matter where I went or how far I ran, I'd always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if and when he would strike again. Because in Jason's game, there was no winning. There was only surviving. And as I stood alone in the dark, I realized that surviving might be the hardest game of all.